This is Besa Luzi, and welcome to Contexti, a podcast by Kosovo 2.0 implemented with the support of the European Endowment for Democracy. This is the show's first episode during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, and it is also the first time I'm hosting it in English. And I've decided to do so because I wanted to talk about how the pandemic has been affecting the work of journalists and media outlets across the region. Specifically, about how governments are using the fight against the pandemic as a pretext to limit freedom of expression, to control access to information, and to restrict media freedoms. Across the region, to different degrees, authorities have been introducing or carrying out various measures, including different forms of harassment, attacks, arrests, and legal threats. There have also been reports of cases of journalists being prevented from attending press conferences or being prevented from obtaining information from health authorities. Many government authorities and individual leaders and politicians are also using the current pandemic and lockdown situation to intensify their portrayals of the media and journalists as the enemy of the people. And these are all dangerous practices and rhetorics which threaten to undermine already fragile freedoms across our countries. To discuss more about these trends and their potential repercussions, I spoke to three people working with the media from around the region, including Flutura Kusari, a media lawyer on the situation in Kosovo and Albania, Ilir Goshi, journalist and media analyst on the state of the media in Serbia, and Nijara Ahmetašević, Kosovo 2.0 regional editor based in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And as always with this show, we sought to provide context to the conversation. So with all three, I discussed the extent to which the attempts and actions of authorities to control information are merely extensions to already existing trends to suppress media freedoms. We also talked about what have been reactions within the respective societies in light of such measurements. And ultimately, what is being done to fight back in order to ensure that our post-lockdown and post-pandemic societies do not end up more restrictive than before. For the first segment, I talked to Flutura Kusari, a media lawyer currently in Pristina. Flutura leads the legal support program at the European Center for Press and Media Freedom and advocates with international organizations to improve legislation to defend freedom of expression. She has been particularly involved recently in advocating against Albania's government attempts to pass a defamation package, which would give the government great control over regulating online media. This is a topic we touched upon in our conversation. But we also talked about other current issues in both Albania and in Kosovo, such as threats against journalists, the financial pressures the media are currently facing, as well as the different approaches with regard to journalists' freedom of movement in both countries. Flutura, thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest at the Contexti podcast of Kosovo 2.0. And I'm particularly looking forward to talk to you on this episode's topic, which is about media freedoms across the region and particularly how they're being affected and restricted within the current situations of the lockdown with the pandemic of COVID-19. We're seeing governments throughout the region in different degrees really using the opportunity to restrict and limit freedom of expression, to control access to information, and also in certain way, in some countries also this attempt to represent and portray the media as the enemy. Your work is in Kosovo and in Albania. So with you, I would like to kind of go back and forth between the two countries and just see what has been happening with regard to these kind of government measures. So can you just start by giving us an overview of what is happening in Kosovo and what is happening in Albania with regard to media freedoms and press freedoms?
Thank you, Beth. I think as a general note, I would say that coronavirus has accelerated the risk to journalists and to journalism. We've seen different countries, work conditions of journalists have worsened, journalists have been fired. I hope I'll be able to speak about concrete cases in Kosovo, but this is like a general remark. We have financial pressure increasing because of lack of advertisement. And also what we've seen is that the governments with authoritarian tendencies have used COVID-19 to make the work of journalists almost impossible. And this has been the case, especially in Albania, because in Kosovo, despite the fact that there are serious difficulties in press freedom and in the way journalists work, etc., still it's much better. We have a much better situation compared to Albania. Now, perhaps I would say that the most pressuring aspect currently in Albania is the fact that the government of Edi Rama has went so far that it has limited access to studios in different TV debates. To give you an example, there is a limitation of numbers of panelists being present in TV shows, which is something that it has absolutely no justification, and it's something that it's purely. It's a measure that has been imposed purely to make TV debates, which are very critical to Roma, quite impossible. This is one of the examples, but hopefully we'll be able to mention other examples as well.
I think one of the things in particular with Roma that was just very much frustrating, of course, but also just shows the extent to which he is trying to depict the media as the enemy is when the crisis broke out in March, at the beginning of March, there he called on citizens to protect themselves against the media. So he made that very very clearly. Was there reactions to this? What was the reaction to this in Albania, but also through other international organizations?
So basically what he did is he made an agreement with telecommunication companies that he would record a message which would be played every time you make a phone call and every time the phone call ends. So basically everyone in Albania was obliged to listen to his voice, where he called on the members of public to be careful, but also to protect themselves from media. Now, this is absolutely unacceptable, because with this rhetoric, what he is aiming to do is to make journalists look like the enemy of the people, because usually you call people to protect themselves from something which is bad to them, meaning the enemy. And this is what he was implying with this message. The reactions were very strong, especially internationally. So you have Mapping Media Freedom, a platform run by ECP, European Center for Press and Media Freedom. You had International Press Institute in Vienna, who reacted to this. They put alerts on their respective platforms because they just wanted to inform internationally that this is what Rama is doing. And also you had reactions not only on this message, but also in other measures and other actions taken by Rama by various institutions. To give you an example, only in the last 2 weeks, you had Reporters Without Borders criticizing Albania. They were ranked in 2 positions lower than previous year. Criticism against Albania on how they deal with press freedom made it to the annual report of Human Rights Commissioner of Council of Europe, Ms. Dunja Mijatovic. You have the number of alerts on the Council of Europe platform on safety of journalists increased since last year. For the first time, there is a dedicated chapter to Albania, full of criticism. And all this shows that there is an increasing monitoring of Albania because of the actions of Rama against journalism, and everything that is critical to him and to the way he governs there.
But has all of this reaction contributed to any change with regard to his government's approach? Do we see it getting better?
I think it depends whom you ask. For example, by nature, I'm a very optimistic person, and I've been working in Albania for almost 3 years now. And 2 years ago, when we started to work on the media law changes that have been proposed by Rama, I was full of optimism that we will be able to stop him. Whereas when I spoke to journalists and civil society society there, they kind of ridiculed me. They're like, we don't have the strong civil society you have in Kosovo, which is very powerful here. And they said that also internationals, they are scared of Rama. So it's very difficult to have international reactions. Nevertheless, we managed together with 7 big press freedom organizations to go together in Tirana to conduct the international mission. We wrote letters to almost all institutions globally, not in Europe. And as a result, this is one of the very few times where Rama was not able to enact a law that he very much wanted to do so. So currently there are media law changes which pose a risk to plurality and also to press freedom in Albania, but they are not yet enforced because the Venice Commission will be issuing an opinion soon, and until that happens, the process has been stopped. So this is to say that the reactions sometimes lead also to some positive change, or in this case, suspensions to what we would consider pure censorship. And this is why we need to keep up the pressure, especially at international level.
Yeah, I'm just to clarify for some of our listeners that you're referring to the controversial anti-defamation package that he has been pushing for in the past couple of years, through which he basically wanted to be able to regulate the online media, to bypass any kind of self-regulation in that regard, right?
Exactly. So what I call the anti-defamation package, the anti-expression package, the idea was that online media is state-regulated instead of self-regulated. To give you an example, in Germany, in UK, also in the region, you have successful instruments such as Press Council, which deal with online content. And this is an instrument that has been recognized by the European Court of Human Rights, by European Union, and is very much promoted so that online media can regulate themselves. And finally, Albania managed to have a press council with heavy investments from Council of Europe, OSCE, UNESCO, etc. Now Rama decided that he would take these competencies, the jurisdiction of press council, and put it to a state of administrative body, which is very much controlled by socialists, by his party. So our main opposition to this law was replacement of self-regulation with state regulation. Hopefully, the Venice Commission will find similar problems with the laws that have been in place.
You mentioned earlier, you were talking about the fact that they've also attempted and achieved to to regulate freedom of movement of journalists by saying that there can be a certain number of people in shows, in TV shows and whatnot. So that's clearly trying to also have control over freedom of movement of journalists. Let's move to Kosovo. What is the situation with freedom of movement of journalists in Kosovo? We know that they can move freely. They are included as part of the group that they do not need to abide by the lockdown measures. But are there instances or cases where journalists are encountering problems in accessing information or going in the field to access information?
There is, I think, now every time I compare Kosovo with Albania, it looks like we're in absolutely another world. Because in different aspects, the situation here is much better. If you take the way the government, and that more precisely the Ministry of Health dealt with the virus, is exemplary compared to everything we've seen so far in Kosovo. In this respect, they have put measures to limit movements, and not only to citizens, so that they can fight the virus. However, there are specific exemptions for journalists. And these have been put in place, which resulted in journalists being able to work freely and not to have difficulties in the way they handle their business. This is one aspect. However, there have been problems with journalists here, especially physical threats. There have been at least 2 physical attacks in North Mitrovica against journalists. And when we speak about threats, we need to mention that not only there is a big problem if you attack a journalist, but another bigger problem is the fact that there is total impunity in crimes against journalists in Kosovo and also the region. There is a culture here where judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and police, they think that crimes against journalists, they shouldn't be taken very seriously because we have much bigger problems. So during the virus, we've seen this happening, physical attacks, and recently, actually today, there are also cyber attacks against online media, with one online media being shut down, taken over completely, another one being attacked. Now, these, of course, make the work of journalists very difficult and also dangerous. To add to this, there is financial pressure for, I think, all private companies that have that work as media outlets. Now, the revenues from advertisements have fallen, and if not blocked entirely, and that's for most of media outlets that's the primary source of survival. And this means that some media companies, I know for sure, they are not able even to pay salaries. They will benefit from the government measures, which, in principle, media should not receive money from the government, but I think in these exceptional cases, and if you live in the Balkans, of course, there is no other solution. So they will be supported a little bit, but it's nothing compared to what they need. For me, a very worrying and concerning example is the firing of 21 journalists and media workers from daily newspaper Gazeta Zare, without any prior notice. Now, I understand perfectly well that it might be possible that the media will at some point be forced to close down. However, there are safeguards for every single employee, including journalists, so that if this happens, they are not thrown in streets. And this is what happened with newspaper Zare, including in this group of 21 media workers, there were also 2 pregnant female journalists. And this it just shows how difficult it is for journalists, because one day they can be working and reporting about very serious stuff, and next day they are unemployed. And this is the situation that we're facing now.
I think in Kosovo also maybe another layer is the political crisis through which the country is going through. We've had during the pandemic the government basically fall down, and there's a lot of uncertainty also politically what is happening. Do you think the situation is putting journalists also in uncomfortable positions, or is it also preventing them from reporting more on COVID, or how is it affecting the work of journalists? We've seen, for example, there's been attempts with a public broadcaster, with RTK, during the political crisis, to also intensify ethnic tensions a bit. And there has been a lot of criticism in reporting that came from the public broadcaster with regard to how the number of cases of people infected by COVID-19 in the north, how they're being registered. Are they being registered in Kosovo as Kosovo numbers, or with Serbia? And so this is also, I guess, not a moment where, besides the political crisis, we also want potential ethnic tension. So how do you see the overall political climate within which now journalists are working in Kosovo?
Yeah, so one thing just to add before I answer to your question is that my main criticism now during the COVID crisis is the way the government has handled press conferences and access to information. I'm a big fan of filing requests for access to information regularly to public authorities, and they have used COVID as an excuse not to provide information, which I don't think that should have been the case. And also, if they allocate, technically, it is possible to allocate sources so that the public is not left in dark. And this has not happened with this government. Secondly, there were cases when they did not organize either the Office of the Prime Minister, Albin Kurti, or Ministry of Health, which in principle has been quite transparent. There were cases where they didn't organize press conferences, although I'm pretty sure that it was physically possible to organize such press conferences. However, They changed their mind after public reactions, and this is a big difference between Albania and Kosovo. Here you have a very strong reaction from journalists. We have the Association of Journalists, which in terms of providing services is not that strong, but in terms of reaction and achieving result is quite strong. So if you have them criticizing public authorities, you see the behavior changing quite soon, and this is what happened. So they improved meantime. Now, with regard to the crisis, this is our modus operandi in the Balkans. It's crisis after crisis, and people like us, 30, 40 years old, we feel like we've lived 100 years because of all the crises that we have experienced. With regard to journalists, I think what happened this time, which I haven't seen before, is that you have journalists divided in two groups. Those in favor and against Vetëvendosje or the other bloc, which I think it's of course this is so unprofessional that it can endanger the work of the life of journalists themselves. Because I think the biggest protection that journalists can receive is if they report in a professional way. I don't see. Of course, it happens rarely, but most of journalists who are reporting ethically, based on good principle, in good faith, etc., they don't experience this kind of threats. I think when it happens very much in those cases when journalism is mixed with activism, and this is for me one of the biggest threats to journalism in Kosovo. I think what is important now is that. You make sure, and there is thirst. Of course, there is thirst for good journalism. I've never seen such an excellent opinions and comments from the public on different pieces, on articles, radio shows, etc., where they comment the content and whether it was for professional, biased, etc. Which we see that people are thirsty for good journalism, and now they can recognize between bad and good journalism. And I think the biggest protection journalists can afford to themselves is, of course, to report in the best way they can and not to mix activism with journalism, because then they put themselves forward to more risk. And this is particularly important in countries like the Balkan countries because of fragile judicial system. I mentioned before, there is ongoing impunity in crimes against journalists. And if something happens to them, nobody will protect them. It takes weeks to have a close protection if you're threatened. So I think journalists should try to provide the best journalism they can. Of course, they are limited, especially because of financial reasons. And then, of course, threat will happen, and there are ways to deal with that.
And what about Albania? Because you mentioned that in Kosovo, you've seen that there's this thirst for good information, for good journalism. What is there that kind of thirst in Albania? Is the current situation also helping expose Rama of his tendencies to have absolute control over the media?
Well, we are able to see this thirst for good journalism in Kosovo because there are independent media, quite a few of them, and in professional media. In Albania, you can't see that because TV stations, TV channels are all captured. And this is not something that I am saying, but there is an excellent research done by Birn Albania and Reporters Without Borders, where they say that the plurality is at risk because television channels and companies are in the hands of very few people, usually rich families. What we've seen in Albania is several online media. I'll mention here Reporter.al, Faktoje, which is a fact-checking service, and these are very few, and also they are not mainstream at all. They do mainly fact-checking and good investigative journalism. But even these very few media are not acceptable for Roma. And I think, and this is from what I've observed in Albania, I think the draft laws, the anti-defamation package was designed mainly to block this type of independent media. So in Albania, I have no doubts that people want good journalism. It's just that there is an environment where good journalism is not possible. And here, let me just mention what we call positive obligations of states, where states are the ones who are obliged to create a favorable environment for journalism. So if in Albania doing journalism is impossible, as it is the case now, it's a failure of the government. It's not a failure of media. It's not a failure of journalists.
And what about just for the end, if you can just very briefly talk about the role of whistleblowers in COVID. It is an area that you've been very much active in. You're constantly advocating for safeguard and protection and support towards whistleblowers. How do you see their role, just for the end?
Yeah, so in principle, the role of a whistleblower is to inform the public if something is going wrong. And this, when I say something is going wrong, it really includes everything that is in the public interest. Now, I think everybody in the world is informed about the whistleblower in China, in Wuhan, who was the first person. He was a health worker who was the first person to alert the authorities about the corona and also the influence and the impact that it can have. Not only that he was not praised, as it should be the case, but he was very much put under pressure, and also he was made to. I think he was. If I don't know the details, but I know that he went under a lot of pressure not to speak up. And now, if you read the articles and analysis worldwide, there is a consensus that if he was to be listened at the time when he was alive, because unfortunately and sadly he passed away, we would not have corona crisis accelerating to the level that is now. So what we've learned from this case of whistleblowing is that we all know how important they are. And there are different countries, including Kosovo, Serbia, who have put very good legislation in place to protect them. But when it comes to practically support them, they are still seen as spy, as informer, as someone who wants to damage the government, and everybody goes after them. So I think the lesson learned from this case is that we need to really pay close attention to whistleblowers, which in the beginning might look like they are not helping the government, but long term it helps democracy. And I think what I would like to take away from this case is that we need to use after we go through this epidemic, we need to use a moment and to update our legislative framework and to make sure that judges, prosecutors, governments takes whistleblowers much seriously.
Exactly. That's a very good note. So actually, we also have to make sure that the larger culture of how we see the role of whistleblowers and the contribution of whistleblowers in the same regard with journalists and the media also has to be changed. So to recognize that they work on the public interest. Thank you very much, Lutra, for all your insights. It was really nice catching up with you.
Thank you for having me.
Next, I talked to Ilir Goshi, a journalist and media analyst from Belgrade. Until 2018, Ilir worked for 4 years at the Slavko Čuruvija Foundation in Serbia, leading it as executive director for 3 years. The foundation was established in 2003 to honor the legacy of the journalist Slavko Čuruvija, who was assassinated in April 1999 in Belgrade. Later, a first-degree court decision found 4 members of the Milošević state security guilty for the killing of Čuruvija. Čuruvija has become a symbol of resistance, known for his harsh criticism of the Milošević regime and also for his advocacy for free, independent press. And the development of free, responsible media has been the work of the foundation over the years. But it seems that many years later, being a journalist in Serbia is again considered a dangerous profession. Over the past few years, the number of attacks on the media has increased, as well as inflammatory rhetoric by authorities and officials against journalists. With Ilir, who was also a member of the Working Group for Safety of Journalists, we touch upon how the state of media freedoms in Serbia has particularly deteriorated over the past 6 years under the leadership of Aleksandar Vučić, including recent attempts to even more control the flow of free and independent information. Ilir, thanks so much for joining us at Contexti today, and I'm particularly looking forward to speak to you in terms of what is happening in Serbia right now with regard to media freedoms. We're hearing from all around the world, Europe, the region, of governments trying and introducing measures with the intent of restricting media freedoms, and similar reports have been coming out of Serbia as well. For example, with regard to press conferences being banned for journalists, there was a case of a journalist a while back who was arrested on the premises of spreading panic and unrest. So there's different information coming out of the country, but can you just let us know a bit about the state of media freedoms in Serbia, even before the pandemic, but also specifically what is happening now?
Thank you, Bessa, for inviting me. Maybe we should first look at the wider context, and the wider context is that since several years ago, it has become quite clear that Serbia is quickly losing, whatever democratic was about it beforehand. It's increasingly losing this character. So this means that also whatever happens with the freedom of media is part of the wider picture. In this sense, basically the whole political power on the state level is assumed by the president, Aleksandar Vučić. The parliament was effectively suspended in the first days of the pandemic and the introduction of the state of emergency. In itself, this measure, the state of emergency, is considered as one of the harshest in all of Europe and maybe even all of the world, with the total ban of movement for, say, people older than 65 years. And also some other measures were introduced. And I'm only saying all this because it's important to understand that media and the control of media is a big part of being able to basically assume all the power, assume to just monopolize public discourse, and that's exactly what's happening. So in the continuation of our talk, I might be using the word government, but when I'm basically thinking Aleksandar Vučić. So even the Prime Minister of Serbia, Ana Brnabić, refers to Aleksandar Vučić as the boss. And that's exactly how things are. And that's exactly how things have been during the past 6 weeks. So the whole nation is sitting by TV screens every night, basically expecting him to tell what's going to happen tomorrow and what new measures will be introduced and if some will be abolished. But there is this there is an obvious, it's obviously arbitrary. It's obviously depending on his own will. So that's the general atmosphere. And control over media is a big part of it, and it's being done in two ways. One is by establishing and sustaining this strong coalition between a wide range of very popular tabloids and basically all of television stations that have national frequency, including the public broadcast service. All of them are basically just transmitting whatever Vučić wants them to tell us, and they basically never even question any of that. So that's one thing. We have tabloids, we have very popular TV stations, and they serve as sound speakers for Aleksandar Vučić and for other government and political officials of the country. On the other side, we have repression towards what's left of independent media. And one part of the repression is what happened the end of March, when the government secretly passed this document in which they said two important things. One was no one from the state apparatus, including people working at the hospitals, is not allowed to communicate to the public anything that has to do with COVID-19 epidemic. So that's one thing. And it effectively prevented any communication between journalists and the sources inside the state and inside hospitals and the general public healthcare system. The second thing they were saying in these measures was that those that without authorization share this data with the public will be treated legally as spreading disinformation in the state of emergency, which is a very nasty definition. I think it leaves the things vague so that people will just ask themselves whether they're authorized or not. But in effect, I think that the goal was basically to prevent any communication with the public and any journalist's work that would be uncontrolled from the side of the state. And just 1 or 2 days later, they made another step, and that was arresting a journalist for publishing a story in which she said that this hospital in Novi Sad, which is a town north of Belgrade, that the medical staff in the hospital did not have enough equipment. And that's really something that's, it's hardly a surprise, and we know that the hospitals were under-equipped, and in the public healthcare system, such as the Serbian one, it is somehow almost expected. So what happened is that once the story was published, the same day, the same night, her apartment was stormed by several special police officers, and they arrested her. They confiscated her equipment. Later, she was released, and several weeks later, the charges were dropped. So that's one thing. They did something that resulted in a very strong public reaction, both domestically and internationally. And that also includes the decision of the government I previously mentioned. And then they decided to retreat. But what remained as the result of their actions is, I think, what is known among journalists as the chilling effect. And that is the feeling with journalists that once they see that someone has suffered consequences of his or her writing, they will be reluctant to risk. So they will simply choose not to publish things that are important for the public and critical of the government. So that's basically what's happening right now. I think a lot of people are simply scared to write.
Yeah, it leads to just an extended kind of self-censorship, because we've been talking about self-censorship in the region for years, that in a lot of instances, journalists just refrain themselves from publishing certain truths or certain information. So it sounds to me that this is just an additional step in that direction. And I would like to just go back to the press conferences, because we've talked earlier, and there was something very valid that you had mentioned, you had said with regard to the press conferences being banned for journalists, is that at the beginning, when journalists were allowed to go and ask questions, then the public and the society at large was also viewing and seeing the government being challenged, and they were seeing their narratives being challenged, and there's the government's so-called truths being challenged, and that this also led to the fact to close the press conferences to the journalists, so that they can remain, so to say, so untouchable. So what is happening in this in this regard in terms of access to information and with the press conferences? They still remain banned?
No, they changed that back into allowing journalists to be present at the conferences. But still, it took, I think, some 10 days maybe to change this decision, as much as health issues were used as an excuse to introduce these measures. Health issues, or should I put it, the apparent decline in the spread of COVID was used as an excuse to let them back then. But what I think really made the change was, again, pressure of the public. And again, I think it's also international public, meaning important institutions such as the OSCE or organizations such as Reporters Without Borders. But what started all that was really an act of solidarity, because in those first couple of days, the government said, okay, no journalists at the conferences, but you can email your questions. And then everyone was confused, okay, we can send questions by email, but who's going to read all that and who's going to make the selection? So it did operate like that for maybe a day or 2 days. And then one of the two independent news agencies in the country, that's Fonet, stepped out and said, okay, we are not part of this because this is not journalism. Press conferences without journalists are not journalism, and we are not legitimizing this by sending our questions anymore. And they were the first ones. And then there was some quiet that lasted for maybe a day. And then this daily newspaper joined in, and then others stepped in as well. So all of a sudden, you had maybe 4 or 5. To call them major would be to overestimate, the influence of independent journalism in Serbia, but they're quite important. And you had this front of 4 or 5 media outlets that basically said no to this. And I think that ultimately it did bring about this change.
I would like to just connect to something that you said about also there being public reaction to all of this. And we know since Vučić has been in power for the past 6 years, whether first as prime minister, now as president, he has gotten a tighter grip on the media, and this has been a continuous problem in Serbia. But do you think that maybe now with this current situation that with what is happening currently, with the fact that, of course, people's lives and health are also at stake, do you think that it can potentially lead to exposing the cracks in a way, to exposing more just the way that they have been governing, and also exposing the way that they've tried to specifically capture and control the media? Would this maybe be some kind of like a good that might come out of all of this?
Well, it's a difficult question, but before I try to answer it, I want to go back to what you said about Vučić. And in all fairness, the media system in Serbia is largely controlled through control of the money flows. Meaning, if you control advertising, and if you control state donations, then you can control the media. And the system of controlling the money flows towards media was developed by the previous government. And in fact, all of the previous governments were very eager to try and control the media. It's just the harshness, the brutality, the visibility of the effort that perhaps makes a difference, and also the efficiency. What I'm saying really is that when it comes to political influence in the media, I don't think any government in the history of Serbia ever either understood why we need independent media or was willing and capable of doing anything to provide this space of freedom for media and journalists. And now to go back to what you asked, I think that on the one side, there is an opportunity in this. And you know how they say that the Chinese use the same letter for crisis and opportunity? I think that no one really checked that ever, but we can just use it for this conversation anyhow. People are actually realizing the importance of having access to valid information, because their lives are dependent on this in the most direct way. So they want to know. And I think it also happens with the tabloids, those that are closely connected to the government. A friend of mine, a colleague, he said, now people can see that, what these guys are writing is basically rubbish. It's useless, because when you get up and get out and get your newspaper. You want to know what's happened, and you want to know what's going to happen, because, should you run for your life or are you safe? So in that sense, I hope that at least some people started recognizing the importance of credible information sources. On the other side, we should not underestimate the importance of having a very solid mainstream media system. In Serbia, it's really chaotic, and if anything, these tabloids and other media that were close to the state, and also the state officials themselves, were the sources of panic, the sources of disinformation, sources of information that would confuse people, and at some instances even cause, as I said, real panic. And if I can make a few examples, for one, we have one of the members of the government staff, that's basically the most important, the highest state body making all the decisions about crisis response. One of the people, Dr. Nestorovic, maybe he is also known in Kosovo, because I think he's known globally as the guy who said that women are basically free to travel to Milan for shopping.
Yes, yeah.
In an effort, obviously, to somehow to kind of mock the pandemic as something not really dangerous. So that was his first public appearance. And then some days ago, he appeared in a morning TV show talking about general topics, because all of a sudden he's a sort of a celebrity. And I remember him talking about the Americans sending a U.S. Navy ship 6 months into the future. And he also added that this experiment did not end well. And he actually believes this happened. So the guy who's making a decision about my life and about the lives of 7 million people in this country believe that the Americans actually did some time traveling. So that's one thing. And then you have that famous text message that was sent out to 2 or 3 million people, I think, on one night at the end of March. So no one knew how things were going to be.
Can you just tell us
there was
about
a lot of
Can you tell us about the
here.
text message? Just what was the text message?
The text message was, I'm trying to remember the exact wording. Situation is dramatic. We are going for the Spanish and Italian scenario. Please stay at home.
This came from the government,
it came from this state government staff, meaning the only body, the official body of the government created to deal with the pandemic. So that was also the first and the last message that was ever sent out by them. This information did not appear simultaneously on their official website, nor on the public broadcast service, nor in any other media. So we didn't even know if it was true. And also what's funny, it would be funny if it wasn't deeply tragic. They only sent this message to users of the state telecom, whereas 2 private mobile operator services did not get the message. Maybe it was too expensive to send it. And then you have the state, which only informs 1/3 of its population that we are going for Italian and Spanish scenario. And just imagine, that night people are gathering to have a quiet evening, and there are so many people that were so scared.
Yeah, it's
and the streets are empty, and you only hear emergency sirens, and it's going to get worse. And then you get this message, and then earlier that day, there was a press conference, this daily conference, and they didn't say anything about things going really bad. And then tomorrow they were like, oh, well, we will just, we wanted to warn people so that they behave, basically. So what I'm telling is that it is exactly the state that is the source of information chaos in Serbia.
So it was part of the strategy to instill fear. And once there is fear, then of course it's easier to try to maintain everybody under their control. But going back to something more hopeful that you said, and that potentially out of all of this, the good is that people are recognizing the way that information is trying to be controlled, and that they are demanding and requesting and basically in need for good information. So I do hope that this is something that will continue. It will continue as a trend in Serbia, also following also in a post-lockdown reality and situation. Thank you very much, Ilir, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
For the last conversation, I touched base with Nijara Ametašević, regional editor of Kosovo 2.0 based in Sarajevo. Nijara is a longtime journalist and independent researcher, as well as a scholar on media in post-conflict societies. During our talk, we discussed specific measurements that the governments there are taking to control information. That is how press conferences are being controlled by selecting which media can participate and what questions can be asked. We also discussed how authorities are issuing decrees and fines to citizens for publishing information that authorities believe can cause panic, thus in the long run, running the risk of limiting the work of journalists and freedom of expression. And ultimately, the dangerous fallouts of all of this: increased self-censorship amongst journalists and even weaker democracies. Nijara, it's very good to have you on Contexti, the Kosovo 2.0 podcast. Recently, we published an article at Kosovo 2.0, the magazine, where you were talking about different measures that authorities are taking in Bosnia and Herzegovina to restrict the freedoms of citizens and also of media in terms of what they can communicate, specifically now during the pandemic. So like an increase in their attempts to control freedom of information flow. So I would like to maybe just start, if you can just give us kind of a sum up and an overview of the media situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina and how now currently this situation is also affecting. So what are the restrictions that they have passed and that they're trying to push forward to restrict media freedoms, basically?
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk and giving me opportunity to talk about this very important topic. I have to say that at this moment, it's like 2 months after the pandemic, I think that the most dangerous measure that was introduced by some of the governments in Bosnia, as Bosnia is a very complex country, so we have 3 levels of government. So at different levels, the crisis staff, as it is called, or the teams that are dealing and trying to follow and they should give information about what is going on to the citizens, they are restricting the access to foreign media. Basically, in practice, it looks like that some of the crisis teams do not allow journalists to come to the press conference or to ask questions.
That's only for foreign media or also for national and local?
It's only for a national. I think at the moment we hardly have any foreign correspondents in Bosnia, except like Reuters and AP and AFP, who do have their stuff all the time here in Bosnia. But it's for everybody, basically. Or even if they allow you to ask the question and come to the conference, they choose the media who are allowed to come, and they choose the questions that they want to answer, which is very problematic. And at the end, the result is that very often the public citizens do not have information about what's going on in Bosnia. So at the moment, if you ask anybody in Bosnia about how many people are tested, do we have tests, do we have everything that we need to respond to this pandemic, I'm afraid that many of us, including me, including journalists, we do not have a way to get information, and we don't know what's really happening behind everything.
And of course, I assume that they're probably selecting the media that tend to be more supportive, so as to say, of the government, or more government leaning. So how is that selection going, and what has been the reaction of independent media outlets and journalists to these measures regarding the press conferences?
Yeah, well, that's a sad picture of Bosnian general media situation, and I'm afraid in most of the region it's like that. And that is that we almost don't have independent media at the moment in Bosnia. Most of the media that we have, they are, and I have to use this term, occupied by political parties in Bosnia and Herzegovina, opposition and those who are in position, I have to say. One part of the media is loyal to the international community and international donors. And then I can say that what we still do have are independent journalists who are or freelance or part of different media, and they are trying to be more independent than the media they work for are. So it's a very difficult situation. And also, this is something that is going on for a very long time, and this pandemic it just made it very more visible. And that is the fact that the independent media in this country are almost dying. And I'm not sure that in a couple of years that we will have any media that we can call objective, professional, and independent.
That's interesting, because I was also reading last week, just recently, the Reporters Without Borders, they also published their yearly report of measuring media freedoms around the world. And with regard to Bosnia, it actually was saying, as far as I saw, that it was saying that there was progress, so it improved in terms of ranking. So how would you comment that in relation to your general observation and assessment that the situation is not good, that there is not necessarily truly independent media in the country?
Well, I have to say that many of us who are working here in Bosnia as journalists are surprised year after year with these rankings. Usually it puts Bosnia in much better position than it is in reality. How do I see that? I have to give you, tell you something else, but I will connect that with the current situation in the media. 2 days ago, the EU special representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina met with one of the political leaders here, and that leader was in prison for corruption, is for a very long time under different kind of investigation. Media are writing about him as one of the most corrupt politicians in the country. He is connected with different, even criminal groups and everything. And then EU, as special representative, goes to meet with him in one city in Bosnia. And after the meeting is over, the EU told that this person is the engine behind the Bosnia and behind the Bosnian path to European Union. So why they're doing that? I think this very similar is happening also in the field of media, that the picture that is coming out from Bosnia is very often given not by journalists, not by people who feel all this pressure, who feel all these problems, but rather by the people who are sitting in their offices or organization, even including media organization, like some journalistic association here in Bosnia, who are paid by donors to give information that will fit into the picture that these big donors or big international organizations want to have or to present about Bosnia.
I think with regard to just the situation of media in general in the region, there have been kind of cries lately, and in the past few years, and there has been this request, I would say, by independent journalists and media outlets throughout the region. There has been this request, let's say, from the EU, but also from international organizations to be more vocal in calling out what is happening. I mean, we're seeing, besides Bosnia, also Serbia is also in a very bad place when it comes to media freedoms. In Kosovo, to some extent, it is a bit better, but there are, of course, problems with these attempts of lynching, publicly lynching, or trying to discredit independent thought and critical thought. And we've seen in different kind of conferences where we come together throughout the region, this request from international and foreign international institutions and also the EU to be more vocal sometimes to our governments in terms of problems with regard to media freedoms. And now also we're seeing problems happening in EU member states as well, like in Hungary. We've seen how they passed the decree where basically Orban will be ruling without being questioned or whatnot. So when we look at also developments within EU member states themselves, there's also cases in Slovenia and in Romania, press conferences being either closed or not permitted for all journalists, and really this information control. It doesn't look like good news for the region in that sense. So it's not a trend just of the region, it's happening throughout Europe and globally as well.
Exactly, but the problem is that in countries like the whole region, basically, I'm not sure that any of the countries in the region can say that we are democratic and free countries. It's a problem that we do not have a means to fight against it. We are not part of the EU, so there is hardly anybody to help us at the moment. And what I'm very afraid is, and what is already happening for a couple of years, that we do not have like open censorship like even in Hungary now or in some other countries where the media situation is very bad. But what we have and what is very dangerous and what will be hard to fight against is self-censorship that is coming out of all these measures and out of all these pressure. And that is something that hardly anybody talks about. And that is something that I'm not sure what is the way or what is the proper way to address this and to fight against this self-censorship. And that's something that when we talk about the media in EU, we do not talk that much about self-censorship that is deep, and that we also have to remind ourselves, even in the past, in Yugoslavia, we have this problem. And then, with the new democracies, we started fighting against it, but then it was crushed and we are back at the beginning. And this is the predominant way of reporting in the region at the moment, I think. And there are even some research that is proving what I'm saying, some data.
I guess to have a change in this direction, there also needs to be more requests from the public in general for more accountability. So I feel like it shouldn't just be a fight of journalists and media. It should also be a request and a fight coming from societies and from people themselves. So, and I wanted to ask in this regard, because I think that in Bosnia, some of the restrictions that the governments there have been pushing forward is also trying to control what citizens can say with regard to the pandemic, what kind of information can be communicated, especially on social media. There was a case of a person who was served a misdemeanor warrant and a fine for posting misinformation on their Instagram profile in Bosnia, and you talked about it in your article. And this is similar to what we're seeing elsewhere of trying to restrict freedom of expression on this pretext of fighting fake news or misinformation. So can you just tell us a bit about what's happening in that regard? Because it's also affecting citizens, these measures that the governments are taking there. And what's been the reaction? Has there been any reaction?
It affects citizens a lot, but also media and different organizations, because this is what pushes toward the self-censorship again, because people are afraid now to talk about anything. Well, in Bosnia, it's always interesting because you have two entities. So in one entity is one regulation, in another entity it's a little bit different. There was a moment when in both of the entities we had this kind of like orders that people should be careful. It was not ordered to be careful, but it was order not to publish anything that could be seen as a fake news or spreading the panic and lies. However, those people who were taken to the police stations and who were fined for doing this did not comment and did not publish anything about pandemic. They wrote about the government. They wrote about certain political parties, and they wrote about the decisions and the orders issued by those in power. And under the pretext of order that is related to COVID and everything, they managed to fine these people. However, in Republika Srpska, after 1 month, they decided that all these fines and all these orders related to the freedom of the speech are withdrawn. So it doesn't exist at the moment, which is also very strange, and we will not explain why it is like now withdrawn and like what is happening at all. However, the message is sent. And now people are afraid to comment on any of the specific restrictions or measures that are imposed by the government.
And maybe just for a final question, how do you see all of this playing out when measures start to be eased up and when we start coming out of these lockdown situations? How do you see that the government in Bosnia is going to try to continue with such measures? So basically, I mean, as you're saying, they're already kind of using the situation to be able to put measures and to try to control any kind of criticism to the government. How do you see this happening, and where do you see it going in a post-lockdown reality?
To be very honest, I'm very afraid. With all this that I already told you, there is one very important and a big threat to freedom and democracy at the moment here in Bosnia, and that is the fact that the state minister of security is a person who is at the same time owner or very influential in a big number of media. One of the most influential dailies here in Bosnia is his property. So that person is at the same time Minister of Security, meaning that he controls the whole apparatus and everything that has anything to do with security in this country, meaning intelligence, police, and everything else, and the media, big number of the media. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really, really afraid, as well of this self-censorship that we will not be able to fight. And I'm afraid that more measures that will be very restrictive and that will influence our day-to-day life, not only work of journalists, but day-to-day life of every citizen in Bosnia and Herzegovina, are coming. And I'm not sure if we are strong enough as citizens, as if civil society in Bosnia is strong enough to resist this pressure that is coming from different sides.
Thank you very much, Nijara, for your time.
Thank you.
And I think that is an important issue to end with, that similar sentiments have been expressed by people working in the media across the region, including what kind of long-term impact the current situation might have on already fragile democracies and already fragile media environments, where financial and editorial independence continue to be under threat. And I'm hoping that this episode will be another contribution toward documenting and drawing the needed attention to the different ways that journalism and journalists are at risk. Thank you, everyone, for joining.